Have you ever played a tabletop RPG where you felt like your choices didn't really matter? Like you were just along for the ride?
Oh yeah, I've definitely had that experience. It's
Yeah.
like you're just watching the story unfold instead of actually shaping it.
Mhm.
I think it comes down to some common storytelling mistakes that a lot of dungeon masters make.
And those mistakes can really derail an otherwise promising campaign. You know, I was in this game a while back where I spent hours, like seriously hours, crafting this character with a super intricate backstory and motivations and relationships. And then as we started playing, it just felt like none of it mattered. The DM had this very specific story in mind, and no matter what choices I tried to make, it just kept moving in that direction.
It sounds like you were experiencing what we call railroading, and that's definitely one of the biggest pitfalls in D&D storytelling.
Okay.
Yeah. It's when the dungeon master essentially forces the players down a predetermined path, regardless of their choices or actions.
So like a train on tracks, no matter which way you want to go, you're stuck following that track. And that can be so frustrating as a player, right? You feel like your agency has been completely stripped away.
Exactly. And it makes the game feel less like a collaborative storytelling experience and more like you're just watching the DM's story unfold.
So how can we avoid this? How do we as dungeon masters make sure we're not railroading our players, even unintentionally?
Well, the first step is recognizing the signs. One of the biggest red flags is when you find yourself constantly dismissing player ideas or steering them back towards your predetermined path.
So like, if the players come up with a creative solution to a problem that I hadn't anticipated as the DM, I should be open to letting them run with it, even if it means throwing my carefully crafted plans out the window.
Exactly. You need to be flexible and willing to adapt to the player's choices. Remember, you're creating a world, not dictating a story.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
So it's more about being a facilitator than a director.
Yeah, you're setting the stage, providing the challenges and opportunities, but ultimately it's the players who drive the narrative through their actions and decisions.
That's a really helpful way to think about it.
Uh.
Are there any other signs of railroading we should be aware of?
Well, another big one is when the outcomes of encounters or challenges feel predetermined, regardless of what the players do.
So even if they make smart choices or roll really well, it doesn't seem to change the outcome. It's like the dice don't even matter.
Right, and that can be really demoralizing for players. It makes them feel like their actions are meaningless.
I can see that. It takes away the thrill of the unknown, you know, that sense of anything could happen.
And that's what makes D&D so exciting. That element of surprise, that feeling that the story could go in any direction.
So we need to create space for that in our games. We need to be willing to let go of our own preconceived notions and let the story unfold organically. But how do we do that without losing control of the narrative? How do we find that balance between structure and freedom?
It's a delicate balance, for sure, and it's something that every dungeon master has to find for themselves. There are some strategies we can talk about, though.
Okay, good, because I was just thinking about one of the things that can throw me off. Sometimes I have a really cool scene planned in my head, maybe like a dramatic reveal or a climactic battle, and I feel tempted to sort of force the players into that scene, even if it doesn't quite fit with their current actions. Is that bad?
I mean, we all have those moments of inspiration, right? Where we come up with something we think is really cool and we want to share it with our players.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's important to remember that the best D&D stories are the ones that feel earned, not forced.
So even if I have this amazing set-piece battle planned, if it doesn't flow naturally from the players' actions and decisions, I should be willing to let it go.
It might mean letting go of some of your own ideas, yeah. Or finding ways to adapt them to fit the current direction of the story.
So it's about trusting in the collaborative process. Trusting that the story that emerges from that collaboration will be even better than the one I could have come up with on my own.
Exactly, and that collaborative energy is what makes D&D so special. It's a shared experience where everyone at the table contributes to the unfolding narrative. But I think sometimes we as DMs get so caught up in the details of our world building that we forget about the bigger picture.
What do you mean?
Well, it's easy to get lost in crafting intricate histories, complex political factions, and sprawling maps. We want to create these rich, immersive worlds for our players to explore. But sometimes we can overcomplicate things.
You're saying we can give our players too much information.
Too much information all at once. It's what we call information overload.
Right.
And it can be just as detrimental as railroading.
Okay, yeah. I've definitely been in games where I felt bombarded with names, dates, and backstory. And it's hard to keep track of it all let alone make meaningful choices for my character.
Exactly. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
It can make you feel like you're just along for the ride instead of actively participating in the story.
Right. And that's the opposite of what we want. We want our players to feel engaged and invested in the world.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we build a world that's detailed and immersive, but also digestible for our players?
Well, one strategy is to resist the urge to lore dump.
Lore dump.
It's when you overwhelm your players with long explanations of history or backstory. It's like giving them a lecture instead of letting them discover the world organically.
So instead of giving them a history lesson about the ancient empire that ruled this region centuries ago, I should let them piece that information together themselves through clues and discoveries.
Exactly. Maybe they find an old journal, or they overhear a conversation in a tavern, or they stumble upon a hidden chamber filled with ancient artifacts.
That sounds a lot more engaging than just sitting through a lecture.
And it makes the information more meaningful because they've earned it. They've actively sought it out.
And it allows them to make connections and draw their own conclusions. So it's not just about the information itself, but how it's presented and integrated into the game.
Exactly. And when you do need to give your players some exposition, try to break it up into smaller chunks or find creative ways to present it. Maybe you use visual aids like maps or diagrams, or you have an NPC tell a story that subtly reveals important information.
So it's about making the information relevant and accessible, not just overwhelming them with a wall of text.
And remember, your players are going to have questions. Let them ask questions. Encourage them to dig deeper into the world and its history.
This is giving me a lot to think about in terms of how I approach world building. But what about the players' own stories, the backstories that they've crafted for their characters? How do we incorporate those into the campaign?
That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of dungeon masters struggle with, because we don't want to just shoehorn those backstories into the narrative in a way that feels forced or unnatural.
Right. We want those backstories to feel like they're organically woven into the fabric of the world.
Exactly. And the key is to see those backstories as more than just isolated details. They're threads that we can weave into the larger tapestry of the campaign.
So if a player has a backstory that involves a lost family heirloom, I shouldn't just mention it in passing. I should find a way to make that heirloom a central element of the story.
It could be the key to solving a mystery, or the target of a villain's plot, or maybe it grants the player special abilities or unlocks hidden knowledge.
So the player's personal stories become an integral part of the world, shaping the narrative just as much as the DM's overarching plot.
Exactly. And that creates a much more immersive and personalized experience for everyone involved.
This is great stuff. I'm already feeling inspired to go back and rethink some of my campaign plans, but I think we need to take a quick pause here.
We'll be back soon to delve even deeper into this topic, so don't go anywhere. So before the break, we were talking about how to weave player backstories into the campaign world. But there's another really important element of storytelling that we need to discuss, and that's pacing.
Pacing. What do you mean by that?
It's the rhythm of the game. The way the story unfolds. You want to create a sense of momentum, but you also need to give your players time to breathe.
Okay, I think I understand. Like
Yeah.
in a movie, if it's all action all the time, it can get kind of exhausting. You need those quieter moments to let the tension build.
Exactly. And it's the same with D&D. You need to vary the pace of the game to keep your players engaged.
So what are some ways to do that? How can we control the pacing of our campaigns?
Well, one technique I like to use is what I call the ticking clock.
The ticking clock.
Yeah. It's basically introducing a time constraint into the story. Maybe there's a ritual that needs to be stopped before a certain date, or a message that needs to be delivered before it's too late.
So you're adding a sense of urgency.
Exactly. It forces the players to make tough choices, and it keeps the story moving forward.
I like that. It injects tension without sacrificing player agency. What are some other ways to control the pacing?
Cliffhangers. Ending a session on a cliffhanger is a great way to keep your players on the edge of their seats.
Oh yeah, I love a good cliffhanger.
Yeah.
It makes you want to come back for more.
Right. Maybe they uncover a cryptic message, or they overhear a rumor about a looming threat, or they face a choice with unknown consequences.
It's like ending a chapter on a cliffhanger in a book.
Yeah.
You can't wait to turn the page and find out what happens next.
Exactly. And cliffhangers don't have to be huge, dramatic events. Sometimes it's the smaller, more personal cliffhangers that are the most effective.
Like what?
Well, let's say the players are investigating a haunted house, and they finally make their way to the attic where they find a locked chest. They spend the whole session trying to open it, but they can't figure out the lock.
And then you end the session right there.
Yep. Leave them wanting more. They'll be counting down the days until the next session so they can find out what's in that chest. And don't underestimate the power of downtime.
Downtime.
Yeah, those periods between adventures where the characters can rest, recuperate, and pursue personal goals.
I thought we were trying to keep the story moving. Doesn't downtime just slow things down?
It can, but it doesn't have to. Downtime can actually be a great opportunity to develop your characters and your world.
How so?
Well, for one thing, it gives your players a chance to explore their characters' backstories in more depth. Maybe they want to visit their hometown or reconnect with an old friend. Or maybe they want to start a business or pursue a romantic relationship.
So it's a chance for them to flesh out their characters, make them feel more real.
Exactly. And it also gives you, as the DM, a chance to introduce new plot threads and foreshadow future events. You can plant seeds that will blossom later in the campaign.
I like that. It's like those quiet moments in a movie that set up the big climax. They might seem insignificant at the time, but they're actually crucial to the overall story.
And don't be afraid to adjust the pacing on the fly based on the group's energy. If they're getting restless, maybe it's time to introduce a surprise encounter or speed up the timeline.
So you're saying we need to be flexible, adapt to the situation.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to pacing. You have to find what works best for your group and for the story you're trying to tell.
Okay, this is all making sense. But there's another aspect of storytelling that I struggle with sometimes. Foreshadowing.
Ah, yes, foreshadowing. The art of hinting at future events without giving too much away.
Exactly. It's so hard to find that balance between giving your players enough clues to make them curious, but not so many that they can predict exactly what's going to happen.
It is a delicate balance. It's like planting seeds. You want to give your players enough information to make them start asking questions, but you don't want to spell everything out for them.
So how do we do that? How do we foreshadow effectively?
Well, one of the most powerful tools at our disposal is environmental storytelling.
Environmental storytelling.
Yeah, it's basically using the environment to convey information and create mood.
So instead of just saying, the ancient temple is filled with traps, I could describe the way the floor creaks ominously underfoot and the way cobwebs cling to every surface.
Exactly. You're not explicitly telling the players that there are traps, but you're creating a sense of foreboding, a sense that something is not quite right.
And that can be so much more effective than just stating the obvious.
It also encourages your players to pay attention to their surroundings and to draw their own conclusions.
So it's not just about describing what the players see, but also about suggesting what they might feel or sense.
Exactly. And you can use all sorts of environmental details to foreshadow events. The weather, the time of day, the sounds, the smells, even the way light and shadow play across the landscape.
So for example, if I want to foreshadow a coming storm, I could describe the way the wind is picking up and the way the clouds are gathering overhead.
And you could have the NPCs start talking about the storm too. Maybe they're worried about their crops, or they're telling stories about past storms that have devastated the region.
So you're layering the foreshadowing, using multiple elements to create a sense of anticipation.
Exactly. And you can use foreshadowing to set up red herrings too.
Red herrings, like those fake clues in mystery novels that lead the detective down the wrong path.
Exactly. Maybe you introduce a seemingly important character who turns out to be a minor player.
Whoa.
Or you hint at a dangerous threat that never actually materializes.
You're keeping your players guessing, playing with their expectations.
Exactly. And that can be a lot of fun. It keeps the story fresh and unpredictable.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of these elements work together to create a truly compelling narrative. But let's talk about the antagonists in our stories.
The villains.
Yeah, the villains. They're just as important as the heroes, right? A good villain can make or break a campaign.
Absolutely. A well-developed villain can provide motivation for your heroes, create conflict and tension, and even challenge their values and beliefs.
But one of the biggest mistakes I see dungeon masters making is creating villains who are one-dimensional. They're just evil for the sake of being evil.
Right. They twirl their mustaches, they laugh maniacally, but there's no real depth to them. They're not believable characters.
So how do we avoid that trap? How do we create villains who are more than just cardboard cutouts?
It all comes down to motivation. Why is this villain doing what they're doing? What are their goals? What are their fears?
So we need to treat our villains like real people, with their own complex histories and motivations.
Exactly. They're not just mindless monsters. They're people who have made choices that have led them down a dark path.
And those choices don't have to be motivated by pure evil, right?
No, not at all. Maybe they're driven by a desire for revenge or a thirst for power, or maybe they're just trying to protect the people they love.
So they might have sympathetic qualities, even if their actions are ultimately villainous.
Exactly. And that makes them much more interesting and compelling as antagonists.
This reminds me of a villain I encountered in a campaign once. On the surface, he seemed like a classic, power-hungry tyrant. But as we delved deeper into his backstory, we discovered that he was actually motivated by a deep-seated fear of losing his family's legacy.
Interesting.
Yeah, it completely changed our perception of him. We still opposed his actions, of course, but we could understand where he was coming from.
And that's the power of a well-developed villain. They can make us question our own assumptions and challenge our own values. They can make the story much more nuanced and thought-provoking.
Okay, I'm convinced. We need to give our villains more depth. But are there different types of villains, different archetypes that we can draw inspiration from?
There are. And recognizing these archetypes can be really helpful when you're designing a villain for your campaign. It gives you a framework to work with, a starting point for developing their personality, their goals, and their methods.
What are some of these archetypes?
Well, one classic archetype is the tragic anti-hero.
The tragic anti-hero?
Yeah. It's a character and they can be incredibly difficult to defeat because they have the power to turn people against one another. They sow discord and chaos wherever they go.
It makes you wonder, are they truly evil, or are they just incredibly skilled at playing the game of power?
That ambiguity can make them even more compelling as antagonists. And then, of course, we have the mad scientists.
Oh, the mad scientist. I love a good mad scientist.
They're always fun.
They're always cooking up some crazy scheme or invention that threatens to destroy the world.
Right. They're driven by a relentless pursuit of knowledge or power, often to the detriment of all else.
And they raise interesting ethical questions about the nature of progress and the limits of scientific inquiry.
Exactly. And then we have the fallen hero, the character who was once a champion of good, but has been corrupted by darkness.
Oh, that's always a tragic story. Makes you wonder, what happened to them? What made them turn to evil?
Sometimes it's a traumatic experience or a loss of faith. Or maybe they were just tempted by power.
It's a classic story for a reason. It's full of drama and pathos.
And it can create some of the most emotionally resonant conflicts in a campaign. Because you see the potential for good in them, the lingering echoes of the hero they once were.
It makes you wonder if they can be redeemed.
Exactly. And that question can drive an entire campaign. And then we have the impersonal menace.
The impersonal menace, what's that?
It's a villain who isn't driven by personal ambition or hatred, but by a force of nature, a cosmic entity, or an ancient evil that threatens to unravel the very fabric of reality.
Oh wow, that sounds intense, like a Lovecraftian horror.
Exactly. These are the villains who make you feel small and insignificant, the ones who remind you that there are forces in the universe beyond our comprehension and control.
And they can be incredibly daunting antagonists, because you're not just fighting a person, you're fighting an idea, a force of nature, a cosmic horror that defies all reason and logic. That's terrifying.
It is, and it can make for a really memorable campaign. And finally, we have the shadow manipulator.
The shadow manipulator.
Yeah. It's the villain who works from the shadows, pulling strings, manipulating events, and using others as pawns in their intricate schemes.
Oh, those are the ones who make you paranoid. You never know who to trust.
Right. They're masters of intrigue, deception, and psychological manipulation.
And they can be incredibly dangerous because their influence is so subtle and far-reaching.
Exactly. They thrive on secrets and whispers, and their machinations can often lead to some of the most thrilling and suspenseful storylines in a campaign.
Wow, this is giving me so many ideas for villainous characters. It's making me realize that I need to spend more time thinking about their motivations, their backstories, and the archetypes they represent. But creating compelling villains is only part of the equation, right? We also need to think about how those villains interact with the world, and how their actions and the actions of the players have consequences that ripple outward, shaping the narrative.
That's a crucial point, because what's the point of making choices if those choices don't actually matter?
So we've been talking a lot about creating compelling stories in our D&D games. We've covered everything from avoiding railroading to crafting memorable villains. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that we need to discuss.
And that's consequences.
Consequences.
Yeah, the actions that our players take should have real weight and consequence in the game world.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually do that? How do we make sure that player choices have a tangible impact on the world around them.
Well, one way is to think about your campaign world as a reactive ecosystem.
A reactive ecosystem.
Yeah, it's not just a static backdrop for the player's actions. It's a living, breathing world that responds to their choices.
So if my players choose to help a struggling village defend itself against bandits, then victory shouldn't just be a self-contained episode. It should have lasting repercussions.
Exactly. Maybe the village thrives, becoming a key ally in future adventures. Or maybe the grateful villagers spread word of the hero's deeds, enhancing their reputation throughout the region.
And conversely, if they ignore the village's pleas for help, allowing the bandits to raid and pillage, those consequences should be felt as well.
Absolutely. Maybe the village falls into ruin, becoming a stark reminder of the consequences of inaction. Or perhaps the surviving villagers, embittered by the hero's apathy, spread rumors that tarnish their reputation.
It's about creating a world that feels alive.
Yeah.
A world where actions have repercussions, both positive and negative.
And those repercussions can extend beyond immediate consequences. A choice made early in the campaign might come back to haunt the player's sessions later.
So you're saying that even seemingly small decisions can have long-term impacts.
Exactly. It creates a sense of interconnectedness. It shows the players that their choices matter.
That's really cool. It makes the world feel more real, more dynamic.
And those consequences don't have to be solely focused on the players. The choices they make can also shape the destinies of NPCs and even entire factions.
So if the players choose to ally themselves with a particular faction, it might give that faction an advantage in a political conflict, leading to changes in leadership or even the outbreak of war.
And those changes shouldn't just be abstract descriptions. Let the players see those consequences firsthand. Maybe they witness the coronation of a new ruler or the signing of a treaty.
Those visual cues can be so powerful.
They really can. They help to reinforce the idea that the players' choices are shaping the world around them. And remember, consequences don't always have to be grand or world-altering. Sometimes the most impactful consequences are the personal ones, the ones that affect the characters on an emotional level.
So a betrayal by a trusted friend might leave a character emotionally scarred, influencing their future interactions and decisions.
Right. Or a selfless act of heroism might inspire a change of heart in a hardened criminal.
It's about weaving a tapestry of consequences, large and small, personal and global, to create a world that feels dynamic and responsive to the player's actions.
Exactly. And that responsiveness is what makes D&D so compelling. It's not just a game, it's a collaborative storytelling experience where the player's choices have the power to shape the narrative in unexpected and often unforgettable ways.
I think that's a great note to end on. We've covered so much ground today, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
There's always more to learn about the art of storytelling.
That's for sure. But I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today. I know I've learned a lot. And I want to thank LitRPG Reads and author Paul Bello for their fantastic article, 7 Common D&D Storytelling Mistakes Dungeon Masters Make, and How to Fix Them. It was a great starting point for our discussion.
Yeah, it's a really valuable resource for any dungeon master who wants to improve their storytelling skills.
And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are some of the techniques you use to create engaging and memorable D&D campaigns? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Until next time, may your dice rolls be ever in your favor.